There's a $6 billion machine hidden under the water around Venice. 78 steel gates lying flat on the seabed across 3 inlets. And when a dangerous tide rolls in, they rise in half an hour, wall the city off from the sea, then vanish again so the ships can pass. It's one of the most ambitious things ever built to hold back the ocean. So why is Venice already planning something far more drastic to back it up? A fix that sounds completely insane. Venice has always lived with the sea. That relationship is turning hostile because of 2 forces pulling in the same direction. The city is sinking, the water is rising. Venice sits on a muddy lagoon built on millions of wooden piles driven into soft sediment over 1,000 years. That foundation has been compressing under the city's weight ever since. Over the past 120 years, Venice has lost roughly a foot of ground to the water, and it came from 2 forces at once. About half of that, roughly 6 inches, was the city physically sinking. Most of that sinking traces back to one mistake. Between the 1950s and 1970s, industrial groundwater pumping at nearby Marghera dropped parts of the city by as much as 5 millimeters a year, and some industrial zones sank 14 millimeters in a single year. Authorities halted the pumping after 1970, but the lost ground never came back. Natural settling still lowers the city another 1 to 2 millimeters every year. The other half came from the sea itself, which keeps rising. Higher tides meeting a lower city. That's the whole equation, and recent monitoring shows the pace accelerating faster than the models assumed when engineers first designed MOSE over 3 decades ago. Most people get this wrong. MOSE was never designed to stop every flood in Venice. Engineers built it to block the exceptional surges, the catastrophic tides like the November 2019 flood that ranked as the 2nd worst in Venice's recorded history and destroyed over $1 billion worth of heritage. The gates activate when forecasts predict tides reaching about 43 inches above normal sea level. Below that threshold, the gates stay down on purpose. St. Mark's Square sits at the lowest point in Venice, only about 31 to 35 inches above the average tide datum. It starts flooding well before the MOSE trigger. That was always the plan. Engineers expected moderate tides at San Marco and accounted for them in the design. When MOSE goes up, the vast majority of the city stays dry. On October 3, 2020, tides hit 51 inches in the Adriatic. Inside the lagoon, MOSE held them to 27 inches. The problem is that the job MOSE was built for is changing underneath it. What counted as exceptional 20 years ago is becoming routine. The barriers didn't just arrive late by accident. The Consorzio Venezia Nuova, a private consortium contracted by the Italian government, built the project from the ground up. Construction started in 2003 with a budget of around $3 billion. By 2014, Italian financial police had unraveled a sprawling corruption scheme. Contractors inflated invoices to siphon public funds and used the proceeds to bribe politicians over more than a decade of construction. Mayor Giorgio Orsoni landed under house arrest. Former Veneto regional governor Giancarlo Galan, who had launched the project alongside then Prime Minister Berlusconi back in 2003, faced charges. The investigation swept up 35 people in total. Prosecutors alleged that roughly $27 million in public funds moved into foreign bank accounts to finance political parties. Orsoni resigned. Prosecutors challenged Galan's parliamentary immunity. The fallout doubled the project's cost and pushed the completion date years past deadline. So when MOSE finally arrived in 2020, it was already chasing an outdated set of assumptions about how fast the sea was going to rise. So how does a wall that big stay completely invisible until the exact moment it's needed? The answer is buried in the seabed itself. Each gate sits inside a concrete caisson bolted to the sea floor. At rest, the hollow gates are full of water, which pins them flat in their trenches. When forecasters see a dangerous tide coming, compressed air is pumped in, forcing the water out. Buoyant sea takes over, and the gates swing up on their hinges into a solid wall between the city and the open Adriatic. Each one spans roughly 66 feet across and stands several stories tall, about as wide as a bowling lane is long, and as tall as a 4-story building. When the tide drops, crews flood the gates again and they sink back into their trenches, out of sight. Running this system, though, is far from pushing a button. Every single closure deploys roughly 100 personnel across the 3 inlet sites. Each activation costs around $220,000, and a single stretch of repeated closures this year ran up roughly $6.6 million in port losses alone. That figure only counts the direct shipping disruption. During extended high tide events, crews have spent days on site, unable to rotate out until the water drops, stranded across 3 separate barrier complexes while the weather dictates the schedule. The operational cost is real, but it's not the core problem. The gates work. The problem is what happens when you run them too often. Every time the barriers go up, they seal the lagoon shut. The tidal exchange that flushes the lagoon and keeps its water oxygenated cuts off completely. The Venice Lagoon is a protected ecological system, home to seagrass beds and fish nurseries that depend on regular tidal flow. The tides bring oxygenated seawater in, carry waste out, and sustain a food chain that has operated for thousands of years. Prolonged closures break that cycle. The economic hit compounds that. The Port of Venice moves commercial shipping traffic the entire region depends on. Every closure stops that traffic dead. Mose was designed to close about 5 times a year. In its first 5 years, it closed 108 times. And in just the first 2 months of 2026, it went up another 30 times in 23 days. The pace is still climbing. Alvis Papa, who heads Venice's Tide Monitoring Center, called the early 2026 stretch absolutely exceptional in both its duration and its continuity. And researchers studying the lagoon project said before long, the barriers may have to close more than 200 times a year for something like 1,000 hours of every year. The trap becomes clear once you follow that trajectory. As closures stretch from hours to days to potentially weeks, a temporary barrier becomes a permanent wall. A sealed lagoon becomes a stagnant basin. Sewage that currently flushes into the Adriatic on the tides pools and rots. Algal blooms, which already killed fish across the lagoon between 2013 and 2015, return in force. The city needs massive artificial pumps just to keep the water breathable. According to a 2026 study published in Scientific Reports by Piero Leonello and colleagues, Mose's effectiveness breaks down beyond about 4 feet of sea level rise. That is the threshold the system could cross by mid-century under higher emission scenarios, well within the projected lifespan of infrastructure being built today. So why not copy the Dutch? Rotterdam's Maesland Caring Barrier gets cited as the gold standard, but that barrier spans a single 1,200-foot wide waterway and protects a port, not a living lagoon ecosystem. Venice's Lido Inlet alone runs about 2,600 feet wide, and the lagoon has 3 separate inlets, feeding a delicate ecosystem the Dutch model was never engineered to protect. The 2 problems look similar on paper. In practice, they're completely different. The proposal on the table sidesteps the barriers entirely. Instead of building a bigger wall, engineers want to lift the city. Pietro Titini, a hydrologist at the University of Padua, has spent decades on the science of Venice's subsidence. His proposal? Inject seawater into deep aquifers between 2,000 and 3,300 feet below the surface and physically raise the ground beneath Venice by up to 12 inches. That rewinds roughly 125 years of sinking. The idea came from gas storage reservoirs in Italy's Po Valley. Engineers pump gas underground there for seasonal storage, filling the reservoirs in summer and drawing them down through winter. When gas goes in, land levels rise measurably. When winter draws it out, the land drops back down. Titini studied that pattern for 2 decades and asked why the same principle couldn't work with salt water permanently. The plan calls for drilling roughly a dozen wells in a 6-mile circle around the city, all within the lagoon. Saline water keeps it out of the freshwater supply. The scale is what makes it genuinely wild. This lifts an inhabited UNESCO World Heritage City that has been standing since before the first Viking raids on England. Every inch of movement has to be uniform, or engineers risk cracking foundations and tilting the very structures they're trying to save. Professor David Dobson of UCL's Earth Sciences Department raised exactly that concern. Inject water too fast or under too much pressure, and the rock fractures. The deeper risk is that fractures don't heal. Once an aquifer's structure compacts, as happened at Megara in the 20th century, it doesn't simply reinflate. The rock has been permanently deformed. Titini acknowledges the risk and argues the process would be slow and low pressure, nothing resembling fracking. He has proposed a preliminary test costing roughly $33 to $44 million, drilling a single borehole to 3,300 feet and running a controlled 2 to 3 year experiment before any full-scale commitment. Full-scale implementation would cost a fraction of Moses' $6 billion. Even at that maximum, though, this buys decades rather than centuries. Titini frames it as a bridge, not a destination. Combined with Mose, it could extend the city's viable lifespan by roughly 50 years. What comes after that remains an open and urgent question. Underground injection for land level management has precedent in cities like Tokyo, where halting groundwater extraction in the mid-20th century stabilized subsidence that had been sinking the city for decades. The science has a foundation. Applying it beneath an ancient lagoon city at this precise scale, injecting into aquifers that have never been mapped for this purpose, has never been tried. Mose bought Venice time. It was never going to buy salvation. The barriers work, and they've kept the city dry through storms that would have swamped it a decade ago. The ocean, though, is outpacing the design. Every year the system runs harder against a deadline it was never built to outlast, and the gap between what the barriers can handle and what the sea throws at them keeps closing. Lifting the city is the kind of engineering bet that sounds impossible until you weigh the alternative. Watching a city that outlasted the Roman Empire, the Black Death and Napoleon slowly disappear into its own lagoon. A city that produced Vivaldi, Titian, and the architecture that defined a continent. A place that has survived 1,000 years of catastrophe through sheer human ingenuity. Losing that is not an engineering failure, it's a civilizational one. That same 2026 study ran every adaptation pathway available, from ring dikes and permanent dams to full relocation of the population. The finding was stark. No strategy preserves Venice as we know it. Every path forward requires transformation, none of them cheap and none of them clean. The question is only which transformation the world is willing to accept. If $6 billion can't save Venice, should the world keep spending to hold back the sea? Or is it time to accept that some places can only be borrowed from the water? Tell us below. Subscribe for more Mega Build stories.